Hello everyone, and welcome back to Story Villa. Tonight, we return with another unsettling set of accounts that have been deliberately concealed beneath layers of silence and deceit. In this episode, we'll journey into the shadowed corners of small-town America, with 8 disturbing stories of secret societies hiding in plain-sight groups that dominate entire communities through intimidation, manipulation, and unthinkable acts. These organizations may appear to the public as harmless civic clubs, historical associations, or charitable foundations. But behind these respectable facades lurks a darkness that has claimed countless innocent lives. Each account you're about to hear has been carefully researched, compiled from eyewitness testimonies, leaked records, and survivors who risked everything to reveal the truth. The names of people and places have been altered to protect those who bravely came forward. As many of these societies continue to operate freely to this day, from Vermont's rolling hills to Kansas's open plains, these hidden networks are so deeply woven into the fabric of their communities that questioning their authority has cost many investigators their lives. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to Story Villa for daily true horror stories, exposing the dark secrets that surround us. And be sure to hit the notification bell so you never miss when we uncover conspiracies they never wanted revealed. Angela Morrison never imagined inheriting anything from her great-aunt Ruth, a woman she had met only once at a distant family reunion when she was 12. Ruth had been a lifelong spinster who lived alone in rural Montana, sending Christmas cards with $5 tucked inside but otherwise staying distant from the family. So when a lawyer from Riverside, Montana, contacted Angela to inform her that she had inherited a house, 20 acres of land, and a small savings account, it felt like she had hit an unexpected jackpot. The drive from Denver to Riverside carried Angela through some of the most breathtaking countryside she had ever seen. Endless grasslands stretched to the horizon, broken by cottonwood groves and the occasional ranch house under Montana's vast sky. Riverside itself was exactly what she expected from a small town of just 23 people. Main Street consisted of a few blocks of early 1900s brick storefronts, a looming grain elevator, and wide avenues designed for horse-drawn wagons. Ruth's house stood at the edge of town, a simple 2-story farmhouse, surrounded by fields, long leased to neighboring ranchers. The lawyer, Harold Perkins, a quiet man with a soft manner, met Angela at the property to hand over the keys and explain the inheritance. Ruth had passed away peacefully in her sleep at 91, he said, and had lived in that same house for more than 60 years. She had been deeply involved in local affairs until the end, especially with a group called the Riverside Fellowship, which ran the town's food pantry and homeless shelter. Angela had taken a temporary leave from her marketing job in Denver to spend a month in Riverside, sorting through Ruth's belongings and deciding whether to sell the property or keep it as a retreat. The house was packed with decades of possessions, from Depression-era furniture to boxes of photographs chronicling Ruth's involvement in countless civic groups. Angela found herself drawn to these glimpses of her great-aunt's life, particularly her extensive volunteer work with the Riverside Fellowship, founded in 1972 by Pastor David Brennan. The fellowship was the vision of a charismatic minister who arrived in Riverside, determined to create a true Christian community where neighbors cared for one another and no one went hungry or homeless, unlike traditional churches that primarily focused on Sunday services. This group operated daily, serving meals to the elderly, offering temporary housing for families in crisis, and running job training programs for those in need. Angela first met the fellowship on her 3rd day in town, when Pastor Brennan himself appeared at her door, carrying a casserole and a warm welcome. In his 60s, with silver hair, kind eyes, and a calm demeanor, he immediately put Angela at ease. He explained that he had known Ruth for decades, wanted to offer his condolences, and assured her that the fellowship would support her during her time in Riverside. He invited her to attend their weekly community dinner held every Wednesday evening in the basement of the old Methodist church, a building the fellowship had purchased years earlier after the original congregation dwindled to just a handful of elderly members. Angela accepted, curious about the organization that had played such a role in Ruth's life. The dinner was exactly what she had expected of a small-town charity gathering, around 60 people sitting at long tables, sharing a hearty meal of pot roast, mashed potatoes, and green beans. The crowd was a mix of elderly locals, young families, and a few individuals who seemed to be shelter residents. "Pastor Brennan," said Grace, thanking God for bringing the community together and asking for continued blessings on their mission to aid the needy. Afterward, Brennan gave a short talk about the fellowship's work, encouraging everyone to contribute in whatever way they could. The group operated entirely on donations and volunteer efforts, he explained, and was always in need of people to serve meals, sort thrift store donations, or provide rides for the elderly. Angela volunteered at the thrift store, figuring it would give her something useful to do while she sorted through Ruth's things. The store occupied a former auto parts shop on Main Street, its display windows filled with donated clothes, furniture, and household items. The manager was Carol Hendricks, a lively woman in her 50s, who had volunteered since the fellowship's earliest days and seemed to know every soul in Riverside. Working alongside Carol gave Angela insight into the town's social dynamics. Customers ranged from bargain hunters to those truly dependent on low-cost goods. Carol, however, had a knack for telling them apart. Locals in genuine need were discreetly given extra discounts or allowed to take items for free, while passing tourists were charged full price. But in her second week at the store, Angela began to notice troubling patterns. Several times, she saw Carol hold hushed conversations with customers, discussions that seemed to involve more than shopping for used items. These exchanges always happened at the back of the store, away from others, and almost always ended with the customer slipping out through the rear exit. Her suspicions grew when she realized the storage room contained far more donations than the shop floor could hold. Piles of boxes and bags reached the ceiling, forming narrow paths between walls of unsorted goods. Carol brushed it off, claiming they were always behind on sorting items. But Angela couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why would a charity keep back merchandise if it needed funds to operate? The answer began to take shape when Angela helped with the fellowship's weekly food delivery program. Every Saturday, volunteers packed groceries into trucks and brought them to elderly residents and struggling families unable to visit the main site. Angela was paired with Tom Martinez, a quiet man in his 30s who didn't care much for small talk, but knew every stop on their route by heart. They drove through Riverside's poorest corners, clusters of mobile homes by the railroad tracks, and isolated farmhouses where seniors lived alone. At each stop, Tom would deliver boxes while Angela waited in the truck, but she noticed the conversations at each door ran much longer than necessary. Often, recipients handed Tom small packages or sealed envelopes before he returned. When Angela asked about it, Tom avoided the question, saying people simply liked to chat or share family updates. Building connections, he explained, was just as important as material help. Angela might have believed him if not for what she later discovered in Ruth's papers, hidden in a shoebox. In the back of her great-aunt's closet was a disturbing collection of documents. Bank statements revealed Ruth had been making large monthly payments to the fellowship for years, sums far beyond what a normal charitable donation would be. Even more unsettling were handwritten notes in Ruth's careful script, expressing deep concern about the group's special services, and her fear that she was being watched by other members. One note, dated only 3 months before Ruth's death, was especially chilling. Ruth had written that she uncovered the real purpose behind the fellowship's food distribution program and was preparing to reach out to authorities outside Riverside. She was convinced that Pastor Brennan and his inner circle were using the group's charitable efforts as a front for illegal operations. possibly targeting the elderly residents who received frequent visits from volunteers. Her final note revealed her fear that the fellowship had caught on to her suspicions. She claimed her house was under surveillance, her phone calls monitored, and she no longer felt safe leaving her property alone. She had hidden copies of evidence in various parts of the house, hoping that one day someone would discover them and expose the truth about the Riverside Fellowship. Angela spent the next 2 days combing through every corner of Ruth's home, guided by her great aunt's cryptic notes. In the basement, concealed behind a loose stone in the foundation, she uncovered a manila envelope filled with photographs, financial documents, and a detailed journal outlining the fellowship's crimes. The evidence painted a chilling picture of long-term exploitation disguised as Christian charity. The food distribution program was, in fact, a drug trafficking network that used unsuspecting elderly residents as intermediaries. Volunteers would deliver groceries laced with hidden packages of narcotics, then collect payments and funnel the drugs through the thrift shop and other fellowship-run fronts. Elderly recipients who grew suspicious or threatened to report the scheme were isolated and later killed with carefully administered overdoses made to look like natural deaths. Ruth's journal detailed at least 15 suspicious fatalities among food program recipients over the past decade, all elderly individuals who had died alone after voicing concerns about the fellowship. Sheriff Rita Valdez had either been complicit in covering up the crimes or dangerously negligent, as none of the deaths ever prompted serious investigations, despite the glaring pattern. Even more disturbing was Ruth's revelation that the fellowship engaged in widespread elder abuse and financial exploitation. They deliberately targeted isolated seniors, won their trust with charitable acts, and slowly gained control over their finances and medical care. Victims were urged to list the fellowship as heirs in their wills, only to die soon after under suspicious circumstances that allowed the organization to inherit their estates. Angela realized she was in grave danger. If Ruth had been silenced to prevent exposure, then Ruth's heir now holding the evidence would certainly be at risk. She packed the most incriminating documents into her car and drove straight to the state capitol, where she handed them to the Montana Attorney General's office and requested protection for herself and other possible witnesses. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the fellowship's criminal network. Pastor David Brennan and 12 close associates were arrested on charges ranging from drug trafficking to elder abuse to multiple counts of homicide. The group was tied to at least 23 deaths over a span of 15 years. Their charitable facade serving as the perfect cover for preying on the most vulnerable. Sheriff Valdez was also arrested, facing charges of corruption and obstruction of justice for protecting the fellowship. Records showed she had received regular payments from the group and had deliberately ignored suspicious deaths in the community. Angela never returned to Riverside after testifying at the trial. She sold Ruth's property and donated the proceeds to legitimate charities dedicated to helping the elderly. Ruth's old farmhouse now stands abandoned, its windows boarded "Upa silent," memorial to the victims of a so-called charity that weaponized compassion against those it pretended to serve. Meanwhile, Marcus Whitfield, a veteran political reporter for the Burlington Herald with more than 15 years of small-town coverage, was about to stumble on something equally dark in Millfield, Vermont. His assignment seemed routine when his editor handed it to him on a gray October morning. Write a heartwarming piece about a rural town of 847 people that had just received a $2 million state heritage grant to preserve its historical character. But what Marcus uncovered would haunt him for the rest of his life. Millfield lay tucked in a valley, surrounded by maple-covered hills blazing in autumn reds and golds. Its main street looked like a Norman Rockwell painting a white steepled church, a general store with creaking wooden floors, and old houses with wraparound porches where elderly residents waved from their rocking chairs. The Millfield Preservation Society had worked tirelessly to preserve the town's 19th century charm, right down to the gas street lamps glowing warmly at night. On his first day, Marcus met Eleanor Ashworth, the society's president, at the town's small museum. A woman in her 70s, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, she spoke with the polish of someone used to public addresses. Her handshake was firm, her smile gracious, and her knowledge of local history encyclopedic. She guided him through exhibits of Civil War relics, pioneer tools, and sepia portraits of long-dead residents, whose descendants still lived in the same homes their ancestors had built. The Preservation Society, Eleanor explained, was founded in 1968 when Boston developers threatened to put a shopping center on the town's edge. Concerned locals united to protect Millfield's heritage, eventually succeeding in getting the downtown district listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Since then, the society had expanded its influence, including nearly every business owner and prominent family in Millfield. They controlled construction, renovations, and preservation, dictating what could be altered and what had to remain untouched. For the first few days, Marcus interviewed longtime residents and photographed the pristine Victorian homes along Elm Street. Everyone praised the society's efforts. Unlike other rural communities overrun with chain stores, Millfield had resisted change. Property values stayed strong, and young families moved in for the town's nostalgic sense of safety and tradition. Yet certain details unsettled Marcus. Whenever he asked about families who had left town, the answers became vague. People would say they had moved on or found better opportunities, but offered no concrete details. When Marcus pressed for contact information to interview former residents, he was told no one kept in touch. The town's public records also struck him as oddly incomplete. The clerk's office had meticulous files dating back to the 1800s, but there were peculiar gaps in recent decades. Death certificates, property transfers, and even high school graduation lists were missing, especially in the late 1980s and mid-1990s. When Marcus questioned this, officials claimed a basement fire had destroyed portions of the archives. Deputy Jim Kowski was the only person who seemed uneasy about the Preservation Society. A large man in his 40s, he had grown up in Millfield, left for college and the army, then returned to join the local police. During their interview at the tiny station, Jim spoke in a hushed voice, often glancing toward the door. The society was serious about preserving the town's character, he admitted, but sometimes their methods went too far. According to Jim, the group held unofficial authority that far exceeded any municipal codes. Homeowners couldn't repaint shutters or replace steps without society approval. Businesses needed Eleanor Ashworth's committee to approve storefront changes or signage. Those who defied these unwritten rules soon faced endless red tape, sudden tax hikes, or unexplained utility problems. Jim described one case in particular, a young couple who bought a rundown house on Maple Street 3 years earlier. They planned to renovate it into a bed and breakfast to attract heritage tourists, but made the mistake of starting work without the society's blessing. Within a week, inspectors cited them for code violations. Their permits were revoked, their contractor received anonymous threats, and eventually abandoned the job. After months of frustration, the couple gave up and sold the house at a huge loss to Eleanor Ashworth's nephew. When Marcus asked if Jim had investigated the threats, the deputy only shrugged. The contractor never filed a report, so there was nothing official to pursue. Besides, Jim added, with a bitter smile, the Preservation Society had always been generous to the police, funding new equipment, vehicle upgrades, and even salary raises. Investigating them would mean investigating his own benefactors. The uneasy conversation left Marcus with far more questions than answers. Determined to dig deeper, he decided to follow the money trail of the Preservation Society. As a non-profit, their tax filings were public record, though obtaining them required submitting a formal request to the state. While waiting on those documents, Marcus drove to the county seat, spending an entire day at the courthouse digging through property deeds and business licenses. What he discovered there chilled him. Over the past 2 decades, the Preservation Society had quietly acquired control of more than 60% of Millfield's residential properties. Some purchases were routine, but more often the society bought up mortgages from banks, then foreclosed when families hit financial trouble. In several instances, the group acquired homes from families who had abruptly decided to leave town, selling far below market value, as if they were desperate to escape. The pattern became far darker when Marcus cross-checked these sales against missing person reports from nearby communities. At least a dozen individuals who had sold their homes to the Preservation Society had vanished afterward, never to be seen again. Their relatives had filed missing person reports with state police, but each investigation had stalled. These people had withdrawn their savings in cash, quit jobs without warning, and disappeared without saying goodbye to family or friends. Authorities had written them off as adults who had chosen to abandon their lives. Marcus tried to contact their families, but the conversations were unsettling. Relatives were hesitant to talk, and some hung up as soon as Marcus introduced himself as a journalist. One woman, the sister of a man who had sold his home to the Preservation Society, agreed to meet him at a diner 30 miles outside Millfield. She arrived, visibly anxious, glancing over her shoulder and lowering her voice, as though terrified of being overheard. Her brother, she explained, had been preparing to retire and move to Florida after decades working at the paper mill. He had lived in the same house his whole life, raised children there after his wife passed, and was eager for a peaceful retirement. But in the weeks before he left, his behavior changed drastically. He grew nervous, paranoid, convinced people were watching him and following him around town. He told his sister he had uncovered something horrifying about the Preservation Society, something that put him in grave danger. Before he could reveal what it was, he was dead. The official report listed a heart attack, but his sister never accepted it. He'd been healthy, with no history of heart issues. Even stranger, his body was found in his basement, a place he never entered because the steep steps aggravated his arthritis. The Preservation Society arranged for a swift cremation, claiming he had requested it in a will no one had ever seen. Marcus left shaken, now convinced he had uncovered something far more sinister than historic preservation. The missing persons, the property transfers, the fear saturating the town all hinted at a conspiracy stretching back decades. What he lacked was solid proof. That came when the state finally delivered the society's financial records. Buried among ordinary expenses were large payments to a company called Heritage Transport Services. Nearly $800,000 over 5 years had been categorized as restoration consulting fees, but the sums were far too large for consulting. When Marcus investigated the company, he found it was a shell operation. No employees, no offices, no real business. Its only assets were refrigerated trucks. That night, Marcus lay awake in his hotel room, piecing it all together. A preservation group with refrigerated trucks, a trail of vanished property owners, and a town where questions could get you killed. The conclusion was almost too monstrous to believe, but the evidence left little doubt. The Millfield Preservation Society wasn't simply preserving buildings. They were eliminating residents who stood in their way, taking their property, and disposing of their bodies at dawn. Marcus packed his things and quietly left town. He now had enough for his story, but he needed to publish it from a safe distance. As he drove through Millfield one last time, Eleanor Ashworth stepped out of the museum and gave him her familiar warm smile, waving goodbye. Marcus forced himself to wave back, suppressing the urge to slam on the gas and flee. 3 weeks later, Marcus Whitfield's expos made front pages across New England. Within hours, State and federal authorities launched a sweeping investigation into the Millfield Preservation Society. What they discovered went beyond even Marcus's worst fears. The group had been running a sophisticated human trafficking ring, kidnapping residents who threatened to expose them and selling them to criminal networks in major cities. The refrigerated trucks had been used to transport sedated victims under the guise of relocating them for work. Eleanor Ashworth, along with 14 other members, was arrested and charged with murder, kidnapping, and organized crime. Investigators uncovered that the society was responsible for at least 37 deaths over 20 years. Many of the missing hadn't left by choice. They were killed in the museum's basement, their bodies dissolved in acid, and their properties stolen through forged deeds. Marcus received a Pulitzer Prize for the investigation, though the honor brought him no comfort. He had exposed a nightmare, but could not restore the lives lost or erase decades of fear. Millfield still stands, its gas lamps glowing over immaculate Victorian homes. But most of the houses are empty now. Few wish to live in a town where a preservation society turned into a murderous organization, killing anyone who threatened their vision of small-town perfection. Music, meanwhile, in Cedar Grove, Alabama, population 2,156. Tommy Rodriguez had been saving for 3 years to open his own auto repair shop, situated along Highway 82 between Montgomery and Tuscaloosa. The town had seemed ideal when he first visited in spring 2021. Main Street still bore the remnants of its cotton-era prosperity, with sturdy brick storefronts lining the road. Rent was affordable, visibility from the highway was good, and there was clearly a need for reliable mechanics in a community where residents drove older vehicles. Tommy, the son of Mexican immigrants in Birmingham, had spent 15 years working in other people's garages, learning the trade while building a reputation for fairness and saving toward his dream. Opening Rodriguez Auto Service in a former gas station on the edge of Cedar Grove's downtown felt like fulfilling the promise his parents had made by coming to America. Business took off immediately. Farmers brought their trucks, seniors trusted him with their cars, and young families appreciated his patience in explaining repairs and offering budget options. Within months, he hired 2 part-time employees and began considering buying the building outright. That was when he first encountered the Cedar Grove Business Alliance. On a sweltering August morning, a black Cadillac pulled into his lot. Out stepped 3 people in suits. Frank Buchanan, the heavyset executive director of the Alliance, Mayor Patricia Donnelly, sharped and in office for over a decade, and Charles Webb, introduced only as a community stakeholder. Buchanan, genial but firm, explained that the Alliance acted as the town's unofficial chamber of commerce. All businesses were expected to join, attend monthly meetings, contribute to fundraisers, and pay $500 a month, plus extra fees for special projects. In return, members received priority for city contracts, favorable permit approvals, and, as Buchanan stressed, protection from unfair competition. Tommy politely refused. His shop was thriving on its own, he said, and he wasn't interested in business politics. The trio exchanged glances. Mayor Donnelly jotted something on her clipboard, and they left without argument. Within a week, trouble began. The city building inspector appeared unannounced, citing violations never mentioned before. Days later, the fire marshal demanded costly electrical upgrades. The following week, a state EPA official arrived after a supposed complaint about fluid disposal. Each inspection carried fines and expensive compliance requirements, draining Tommy's finances. Worse, his customers started disappearing. Longtime clients stopped coming, offering vague excuses about going elsewhere. Rumors circulated he used cheap parts, was under investigation. His insurance was invalid. Then one evening, Janet Morris, an elderly customer, visited after hours. Nervous, she admitted that Buchanan had approached her at the grocery store. Warning her, Tommy's shop was under state investigation for fraud and suggesting customers could face legal trouble for sticking with him. Alliance businesses, he claimed, even offered discounts to locals who supported true community entrepreneurs. Janet also revealed darker truths. Those who defied the Alliance often faced sabotage, break-ins, vandalism, or equipment failures. The Alliance's leaders had deep control. Buchanan's family owned the local textile mill, the town's largest employer. Mayor Donnelly's husband ran the only bank. Charles Webb owned the biggest farm and controlled key agricultural contracts. Together, they could strangle any dissenter, financially, professionally, and socially. Over the years, they had eliminated dozens of competitors, forcing every business in Cedar Grove to bend to their terms. Tommy realized the Alliance was essentially a protection racket. Pay the monthly fee, and you survived. Refuse, and you were destroyed. His suspicion hardened into certainty when he found courthouse records showing failed businesses, sold for pennies to shell companies secretly owned by Alliance members. Others had suffered accidents, restaurants burned down, shops exploded, always with insurance payouts benefiting Alliance-connected owners. Determined, Tommy began documenting everything, recording conversations, taking photos, collecting paperwork. He reached out to business owners in nearby towns and uncovered a wider network of such alliances across rural Alabama, all using the same playbook, with backing from corrupt officials. But the Alliance discovered his digging. One Sunday night, his shop was broken into, not robbed, but searched. Realizing his life's work was now at risk, Tommy contacted the FBI in Birmingham. His evidence, combined with complaints from other towns, laid the groundwork for a sweeping federal case. Investigators would eventually expose the Cedar Grove Business Alliance and its partners as a criminal enterprise that had controlled local economies for more than 2 decades. Frank Buchanan, Mayor Patricia Donnelly, Charles Webb, and 14 other members of the Alliance were indicted on charges of racketeering, extortion, conspiracy, and arson. The investigation also led to corruption cases against officials from various government agencies, who had helped target business owners that refused to comply. After the arrests, Tommy Rodriguez reopened his auto repair shop, but the ordeal had permanently altered his view of small-town America. He had learned that behind the charming image portrayed in films and television, some communities concealed criminal syndicates that controlled every corner of economic life. The American dream was still attainable, but only for those willing to resist forces that twisted entrepreneurship into extortion and turned civic pride into organized crime. Cedar Grove is still struggling to recover from the Alliance's decades of domination. Many of the businesses driven out during those years never returned, leaving empty storefronts along Main Street as silent reminders of the entrepreneurs who refused to pay protection money to criminals masquerading as civic leaders. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had always been drawn to the hidden gaps in history, the events communities preferred to forget. A professor of American Studies at Kansas State University, she had built her career studying the darker corners of small-town life, often scrubbed from official accounts. So when the Harmony Historical Committee invited her to research and write a commemorative book for the town's sesquicentennial, she saw an opportunity to explore the inner workings of an unusually insular community just 40 miles from Topeka. Harmony, Kansas, population 934, was a town where most families could trace their roots back at least 3 generations. Founded in 1873 by German immigrants who purchased prairie land from the railroad, Harmony had weathered economic cycles that devastated other towns. Its stability came from cautious planning and conservative financial habits. The commemorative project was overseen by Councilman Robert Hayes, a soft-spoken man in his 50s, whose great-grandfather had been one of the founders. Hayes ran the local insurance agency and had served on the council for more than 10 years. He explained that the committee wanted a complete history, one that celebrated the town's progress and honored the families who had built it over 5 generations. Sarah was granted access to Harmony's archives, stored in the library basement and supervised by Grace Peterson, the librarian of 37 years. The records included council minutes, school board documents, church registers, and hundreds of photographs dating back to the late 19th century. Grace was helpful, but Sarah noticed troubling gaps. Some time periods were barely documented at all. The largest void appeared in the 1960s, when the town had undergone sweeping changes, mentioned only vaguely in records: population shifts, major property sales, and the founding of new organizations. Grace explained that many files had been destroyed by a flood in the 1980s to fill the holes. Sarah interviewed longtime residents, but found resistance whenever she brought up the 1960s. Older citizens grew evasive, offering only vague references to hard times. Younger residents seemed genuinely unaware that anything significant had happened, as though the story had been deliberately erased rather than forgotten. Her breakthrough came when the daughter of a recently deceased woman offered her a box of clippings, photos, and notes discovered in the attic during an estate cleanout. The hidden documents revealed a disturbing episode from the summer of 1965. According to newspapers from nearby towns, Harmony had been the site of a mass disappearance that drew state and federal attention. Over 6 weeks, 13 families, 57 people vanished. Their homes were untouched, belongings left behind, bank accounts unused. The families were relative newcomers, all having moved to Harmony within the previous 5 years. They came from different backgrounds, but shared one trait: each had pushed for modernization. They had proposed updating the school curriculum, allowing Sunday commerce, and even permitting social dancing at community events. Their disappearance silenced all such debates, preserving the town's traditional order. Sarah dug deeper through Kansas City archives and found that investigators had once combed the area extensively. State police interviewed hundreds, searched farmland, but found no trace. The community insisted the families had simply chosen to move elsewhere, though there was no evidence. Some of the missing had enrolled children for the coming school year. Others had begun construction projects. One family was in the middle of building a new house when they vanished. Even more disturbing was the timing. The disappearances came shortly after these families began organizing against the Clerical Committee's control over land development, church-based civic requirements, and the exclusion of non-Lutheran newcomers. To Sarah, the pattern suggested deliberate elimination of dissent. The committee, far from a benign cultural group, seemed to have orchestrated a purge of those who challenged Harmony's traditions. When Sarah checked courthouse files for confirmation, she found the sheriff's department records from 1965 missing. ALLEGEDLY, lost during a 1990s renovation. Property deeds showed that homes and businesses of the missing were sold within months, often at suspiciously low prices. Most ended up with long-time residents. Sales had been routed through a Topeka law firm that no longer existed, and the attorney responsible was long dead. The trail hinted at systematic theft masked as legal transfers. When Sarah raised her concerns with Robert Hayes, his reaction confirmed her suspicions. He grew defensive, dismissing her conclusions as misinterpretations, and urged her to focus on positive aspects of Harmony: agriculture, education, heritage. He added that the committee questioned whether she was the right person for the project, suggesting a local writer might better understand the town's values. The veiled warning was clear, but Sarah pressed on in secret. She made copies, interviewed outsiders, and contacted law enforcement about reopening the case. Officials told her the statute of limitations had expired, and without evidence there was nothing to pursue. Still, her research showed the 1965 vanishings were not unique. Similar turnovers had occurred earlier. During the Depression, families advocating for federal aid disappeared. In the 1950s, those who supported integration left suddenly after Brown v. Board. In each case, the historical committee had played a central role, quietly determining who belonged and who did not. The committee's dominance stemmed from control of schools, the council, and business groups. Families marked as threats were denied jobs, services, and social standing until they left. Sarah's final discovery showed the practice had continued more recently, though by softer means, persistent harassment, until dissenters relocated. Their departures explained away as voluntary. When Sarah attempted to share her findings, she discovered that even the sheriff's department was entwined with committee families. Her investigation had been monitored from the start, and leaders were already moving to discredit her. Threats followed, along with warnings that her academic career could suffer if she continued. In the end, Sarah abandoned the project, resigning under pressure. The committee hired a local writer, who produced a glossy book filled with cheerful photos and tales of community unity. It contained no mention of disappearances or purges. At Harmony's sesquicentennial, visitors praised the town's beauty and friendliness, unaware they walked through a place where dissent had once been met with disappearance, and where challenging authority could still be dangerous. Jennifer Walsh believed she had found the ideal suburban retreat when she moved to Willowbrook, Ohio, in spring 2022. Home to 3,411 residents, the town nestled in rolling hills half an hour from Columbus, with tree-lined streets and immaculate colonial and Tudor-style homes. Jennifer Walsh soon discovered that beneath Willowbrook's polished surface, the same patterns Sarah Mitchell had uncovered in Kansas were quietly at work. Newcomers who pushed for changes to school policy, zoning rules, or even community events often found themselves isolated, their businesses boycotted, and their families pressured to leave. Local leaders spoke warmly about unity and tradition, but behind closed doors, dissent was treated as a threat to be eliminated. What had once happened openly in Cedar Grove and Harmony was now hidden behind layers of bureaucracy, subtle harassment, and carefully crafted public relations campaigns. The methods had evolved, but the outcome remained the same. Control of the community rested with those who believed conformity mattered more than democracy. For Sarah Mitchell, Tommy Rodriguez, and others who had glimpsed the darker side of small-town life, the lesson was clear. The American dream could survive only if people refused to surrender it to those who disguised extortion as development and oppression as tradition. Small towns may look like the safest places in the world, but sometimes the quiet streets hide the loudest secrets. If you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden truths behind America's small towns. And remember, appearances can deceive, but history never forgets.